And this is what I've been objecting to with regards to this group mentality from the beginning. It seems to me that it's fundamental danger. The fundamental danger is the devaluation of the sacredness of the individual as the primary category. You replace that by group identity, you have no idea what kind of devil you're messing with. Or maybe you do to some degree. You experienced it a bit because you messed about with that devil and you got tempted, and 7,000 people told you were right. It's like, imagine you're a political leader. Okay, now imagine 30 million people tell you that you're right, and they chant that in a mob. And they do that everywhere you go. That's what happened in Germany. And then you play to the crowd. You're that actor. You play to the crowd, and you get hungrier and hungrier for that validation. And you train yourself to say anything the crowd demands, no matter how dark.
Right.
And
I find it extremely worrying, which is why I speak very, very loudly in the way that I do, especially online, because that's exactly what we're starting to see online. People saying whatever it takes to get that same level of validation and affirmation every single time.
Welcome to episode 120 of the Mikhaila Peterson podcast. This is an absolutely incredible episode. It's with Africa Brooke and my dad. Africa is one of the most eloquent guests I've had on, and her interaction with my dad was heart-wrenching. She wrote the viral article, Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness, which I've linked below. Africa Brooke spoke about what made her write that article and the effects it had on her life afterwards. We ended up discussing wokeness to politics, religion, racism, how to stop your ego from destroying your life, how to stop narcissism from destroying your soul. It was mainly an episode between Africa and my dad. I surprised her with my dad, to be honest, but I enjoyed it immensely. This is not one to miss. Also, I'm staying in Nashville. Nashville's awesome. Franklin's amazing too, but I'm very allergic to it. It's just outside of Nashville. So back to a condo for me, surrounded by cement. If you enjoy this episode, hit subscribe. Africa Brooke, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled that we're able to do this. And I think the timing is perfect, actually, because I know we've tried to do it a few times before. But there's something about this time specifically, just the timing of this, that feels very, very aligned. So I'm very, very happy to be here with both of you. Thank you.
Maybe we had to cancel a few times because my dad had to join. Who knows?
Right? I think so. I think that might have been it.
Okay, before we get started, one, I want to read a paragraph from the article you wrote that went viral, and then I'm going to get you to introduce yourself, and then we can get started.
Beautiful.
So this is why I'm leaving the cult of wokeness. I can no longer be an active participant in any culture or movement that encourages groupthink, outrage on demand, fear and violence, revamped segregation, fabricating history, cancellations masked as accountability, self-centeredness, normalization of racism towards white people, the disempowerment of Black people masked as social justice, the constant redefining of existing language, ignoring self-responsibility, constant pathologizing, oppressed versus oppressor mentality, and the I almost did the entire thing with no errors, and the pressure to conform and comply. It's exhausting, and honestly, I have better things to do with my time, not to mention it's killing us. Okay, now you can do your intro.
So my name is Africa Brooke, and I am a writer, I'm a consultant, and I'm also a speaker. There are many other things that I do, but that's the best way to kind of encapsulate everything. So my journey into the work that I do now, which is specifically focusing on the costs and the effects of self-sabotage and self-censorship, began about 5 years ago. We can go into this later, or I can kind of just give a little bit of a brief summary now. It began 5 years ago when I got sober. And me getting sober wasn't just a decision that I made overnight, and then now I have 5 years of sobriety. it was actually a very grueling, soul-destroying process. And I had relapsed 7 times before that, between the ages of 19 to 24. And I always say that what was different about that final time in 2016, when I was just so physically exhausted with that cycle, is that I became curious about what that cycle actually was. I started to get curious about human behavior, about the concept of self-sabotage, which is something that I discovered just through researching, wanting to understand my own behavior. And it's what leads me to the work that I do now, where I ended up looking at my own subjective experience, but it ended up speaking to hundreds, now thousands of people, speaking to academics, speaking to people that were addicts, speaking to people in my family who also experienced addiction. And it slowly started to become something that felt like a responsibility for me to give people this information. And now I don't just focus on the self, the individual. I now look at self-sabotage and self-censorship through the lens of the collective, which is where my letter comes from. And it kind of speaks to that.
Okay. So when is this letter from and how many people have read this?
This letter was published on January the 2nd, 2021. And I had been writing it for about 6 months, but, 2 years in the making, if you will. But when I published it, it was only to a very small newsletter of mine, maybe 2,000 people. And it just took off. And by month 6, it had been read by 3.5 million people. And I mean, it's not a short letter, it's 4,000 words, which for anyone to have read even half of that in the time that we're in right now, where people prefer anything that is short and quick, it really tells me something. And now it's been read by over 4 million people.
Wow. Okay. So before you wrote this, you said, why I'm leaving the cult of wokeness. So what were your beliefs prior to the publication of this letter? And how have they changed?
That's a good question. Let me just sit with that for a second. What were my beliefs prior to this letter? I wouldn't even be able to sort of list them in a very neat way, because I thought I was a very balanced person. I had never over-identified with any kind of movement. I had never seen myself as a firm part of social justice, if you will. I had friends that were part of those movements, etc., but I had never seen myself in that way. But the thing is, you don't often realize just how much a label is impacting you until you see yourself act in a way that you wouldn't expect. So in terms of beliefs, for example, I didn't believe that all white people were racist, even though this was common rhetoric that I was hearing, and to the point where it was just kind of normal and expected for me to hear people say things like that, but then in my mind, I would say, okay, they don't actually mean every white person. They're just talking about the system of whiteness, et cetera, et cetera. So I had been in certain spaces long enough to kind of understand what people, quote unquote, really do mean. So it's not as if I thought in that way, but for me, the fact that it was even normal for me to hear things like that is what started to make me a little bit uncomfortable. My beliefs were still very much what they are now, but I think the issue was that I was afraid to actually voice what my true values were. I was afraid that if I say, actually, no, I don't agree with that person who's on the left, and I actually very much agree with that person who is on, quote unquote, the right, that I shouldn't be thinking that way, that I was betraying the movement in some kind of way, that because I'm Black, because I'm woman, because et cetera, I shouldn't be thinking in this way. So I would say my beliefs weren't really different from what they are now, but I was holding back from actually expressing my true values and my truest thoughts.
How do you think you found what your true values and your true thoughts were? And how did you come to the realization that you weren't, that you were implicitly participating in something akin to self-censorship?
Yes. I think it's when I realized that I was crossing my own boundaries. that's when I was reminded of what my true values were, because I value honesty even when it's uncomfortable. And that's something that I've always spoken about publicly in many different ways and talking about other things. But essentially, I believe in honesty even when it's deeply uncomfortable. But I wasn't being honest myself. Maybe behind closed doors, I was. Maybe behind closed doors, I was listening to thinkers like yourself, Jordan, who I had been told that I shouldn't listen to. Because of certain identity markers like the ones I've mentioned, Black, woman, etc. So it's when I realized that I was crossing my own boundaries, and it was actually making me quite sick, because I think for many people might resonate, but when you suppress something long enough, it has to go somewhere. So if you just hold it and hold it and hold it, you can get physically sick. And migraines are something that I've been getting since I was about 11, actually. And from about 2019 all throughout 2020 last year, I was getting severe migraines. And this was when I was internally battling with just censoring myself and feeling like it's wrong for me to think these things, let alone express them publicly. So I would say that I was reminded of what my values were when I realized that I had been crossing my boundaries.
Okay, so I got a couple of questions about that. So if I got your story right so far, so you said that you had more or less implicitly and perhaps somewhat explicitly accepted a version of yourself that was in alignment with group identity categorizations. You said, well, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm young. So the proper set of opinions for me to have and express is this set. Mm-hmm. And then you noticed that you felt or thought at least some things that were in contradiction to that. And then you noticed that you were afraid to express those. And then you started to realize that perhaps the fact that you weren't allowed to express those or to explore them was associated with stress at least, and then with whatever the contribution of the stress might be to your vulnerability. So exacerbating did your new explicit beliefs start to develop as a consequence of that? And what changed for you?
What changed for me was a very, very, very specific moment that I mentioned in my letter as well. It was last year when, I would say this was May or June, when, the racial uprising in the US was happening. George Floyd, the story of his killing spread all across the world, essentially. And this was a time where I found myself feeling extremely challenged. I found myself feeling the pressure to perform in a way that was identical to other Black people, that I wasn't allowed to actually sit back and say, wait, what actually happened? What is the story? There was a very specific story that I was supposed to take on board, and I was supposed to outwardly...
What was that story that you were supposed to take on board exactly?
Right. So the story specifically that I felt I needed to take on board was that Black people were being hunted down in the US, and that racial divide, the current racial divide that we're seeing in the US. And bear in mind, I don't live in the US. I'm in London. I'm in the UK. I've never been to the US in my entire life. I'm not, I wouldn't be able to tell you the ins and outs of the politics of America. Black people are being hunted down. And as a Black person, it is your responsibility to speak against white supremacy. It is your responsibility to turn to every single white person in your life and ask them why they are not speaking about this very specific situation in the US. So it was along those lines, but it wasn't just happening online. It was also happening offline. And I felt this pressure. And you know what? I'll be very honest. At the same time as me feeling that pressure, I felt a deep sense of connection to people that looked like me. It was a very emotional time. I felt like we were all coming together, and there's this sort of unity that I had never experienced before. Yes, there was a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and I think both can be very essential ingredients depending on the context. But soon after that, I started to feel uncomfortable because there seemed like there wasn't any room for questioning. You just had to follow what you were being told to do. You just had to play along to the script. And if you were white, you were supposed to apologize for all the sins of your ancestors and the sins that you are going to commit yourself in future because you're white, right?
So do you start to wonder then maybe that the point of the moral outrage is to encourage the following that you were finding psychologically objectionable, rather than to redress the hypothetical social wrongs that were being that are being manifested? Is that
right? Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And the specific incident that I'm talking about here was born from that. So my following was pretty big at that time. I would say 50,000 or so, which is still a lot of people. And I was resharing a lot of posts that other people were sharing as well, about why it's important, especially if you're white, to speak up at this time, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting about this is that I've never been someone that will just instantly share something or say something because I feel that I should, which is why when Mikhaila, you asked before, what were your beliefs? I could easily say that I feel like I've always believed the same things, but it's about what I was actually expressing outwardly, right? So I was sharing a lot of things because of the emotions that I felt, because of the narrative that as a Black person, this is your opportunity to stand for something, resharing a lot of things. And there was a man who sent me a message, and this wasn't an unkind message or anything like that. When I look at it now in retrospect, he was just asking if everything that I'm sharing and everything that I'm saying right now is the best approach to take. I believe this was a man who was familiar with my work before, so he felt as if there was something out of character. So he asked me if this was the best approach to take. This was a private message. And instantly, it didn't even cross my mind to have a conversation with him privately. My instant thought, which is a thought I had never in my entire life had before, was, how dare you question a Black woman in that way? That was my first thought. I've never thought in that way before. I'm open to having conversations, difficult conversations. I've been doing it for years. But in that moment, because there was just such a perfect environment that had been created, that was my first thought. So I screenshotted that message and I posted it onto my feed to my audience for all to see. And of course, I got exactly what I needed in that moment. I got exactly what my ego was looking for. Thousands of people telling me that this man was wrong. People telling me that I shouldn't have to educate anyone. That's kind of the common social justice language. No one is here to educate you, especially.
Or to do unpaid emotional labor.
Right, there we go. Emotional labor, especially because I fall under certain identity markers, which are seen as more important than others. A Black woman shouldn't have to educate you. So that was about 20 minutes, 20 very, very long minutes, and thousands of people sort of swarming. It was a very, very visceral. And the validation and affirmation that I felt in that moment was like nothing I had experienced in a while. And it was almost like an out-of-body experience. And maybe someone else hearing this might think, well, it's just a fucking Instagram post. But I was seeing myself in a way that I had never seen myself before. It's almost like I was hovering over myself, holding my phone, seeing a flood of this validation coming in. So I publicly shamed this man who had simply just asked a question, and I didn't even have to deal with him. It's not, and it's really important for me to talk about these things in a very open and honest way. But in that moment, I dehumanized him. He wasn't a human being. That's just a question that I received, and I didn't have to process it. Ask myself, why do I feel uncomfortable? Is this person not owed some kind of response, or not at all? He messaged me in a private place. Should I not give him the respect of doing the same? No, I didn't. So within that 20 minutes, I think about 6,000 to 7,000 people commented or liked this post, and something just felt as with the same intensity that it felt validating and affirming, I just felt sick. It was just like that, as if I had snapped out of something. And I know what that something was, because obviously now I know I had been, almost ideologically possessed, and I had no idea,
and what an appeal to narcissism you had. It's stunning. Right? I'm amazed that it's so interesting that you experienced that in all its potency, right? Yes. The elevation of your opinion to unquestionable, the social validation of that, extraordinarily powerful and tempting. And then to notice that it had actually made you sick. That's really something.
Right.
That's really impressive. Yeah. I don't think people are built for the level that social media can give you at the moment, like 6,000 or 7,000 people all agreeing with you. It's really hard to psychologically overcome that.
Right. In 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, which on social media it's 2 minutes. If you're sitting there and you're holding your phone, and because I'm a very visual person, sometimes I picture this, being surrounded by that amount of people who are telling you that you've done a great job, that man, he was wrong, he shouldn't have spoken to you in that way. That speaks to a part of me that needs that, a part of me that needs that in a way that is completely unrelated to what was actually happening in that moment. But that moment that I felt sick, I just felt like, Africa, what are you doing? What are you actually doing? And I removed the post.
And what were you doing? What were you actually doing?
Gosh.
What do you think it was that made you sick?
I was performing. And I know performance very, very well. Having gone through what I did with alcohol, and my father, when we were growing up, he was also an alcoholic. We grew up in a very, very abusive home. He was physically abusive, and which is where self-censorship actually came from for me from a very young age, because when you're in such an uncertain environment, you learn how to navigate it pretty quickly. You learn how to censor yourself so that you can stay safe. So I learned how to perform from a very, very young age, to perform whatever version is going to make him happy, whatever version is going to make him less likely to hit me or my siblings or my mum. And in that moment, and I've only said this out loud maybe twice, but in that moment with that man, that kind of awakening, that very rude awakening, I felt like I was performing the version of myself that would stop me from getting hit or mobbed by the public.
Hey folks, this episode is brought to you by Super Speciosa. Super Speciosa is a kratom company. Like so. Kratom is a herb related to the coffee plant. The leaves or extracts from the leaves, like this, have been used as a stimulant and a sedative. It works on opiate receptors in the brain, so it's been used to treat chronic pain, digestive ailments, and aid in withdrawal from opiate dependency. I always advocate for dietary changes to enhance mood before anything else. Diet, exercise, infrared saunas, avoiding inflammatory foods, which are kind of like poison. But if you're still having trouble, or if you have physical pain and you've already tried other ways to deal with it, kratom might be worth a shot. It's great for energy support. Some people will use it as a substitute for coffee or as a pre-workout. Some people use it to manage stress and to help them relax. Super Speciosa has different strains. This one's red. Some help you relax, some give you energy. The most important part of Super Speciosa, and the reason I really like them, is because their kratom is reliable, third-party lab tested, and approved under the American Kratom Association's Quality Standards Program. In these capsules, it's only kratom. That's the other reason I like it. Kratom in a capsule. Remember, because this works on opiate receptors, it can cause addiction if you overdo it. So do your research. Google everything you take. Be super paranoid about what you put in your body. I wish I'd known about something like kratom when I was getting off morphine for my multiple joint replacements. It would have been super helpful. Go to getsuperleaf.com/MP and enter code MP for 20% off if you want to give these bad boys a shot. That's getsuperleaf.com/MP, code MP for 20% off. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
So you removed the post, and then
Yeah.
what happened afterwards? Where did this go?
I removed the post and I just retracted internally. But externally, I just removed the post and I pretended that it had never happened. A lot of the work that I do is public. A lot of the conversations I have are public. So I kind of just continued. But behind the scenes, this is when I started to really want to understand exactly what had happened in that moment. What had I been experiencing for the past 2 years? And that's when my letter started taking shape. And my letter was just a journal entry to begin with, just writing it to myself so that I could say that I'm done. I don't want to play this game anymore. This game is not just making me sick, but it's making all of us sick. And writing has always been the way that I'm able to really make sense of how I feel without feeling like I need to necessarily express it vocally. And I would say that's what really saved me from slipping into shame, because everything that had happened with that man, it could have been very easy to shame myself or to either just pretend it never happened, which is something that I see a lot actually. Just denial, just the theme of denial runs through everything that I'm seeing play out in the culture. I see things like that all the time where someone will publicly shame someone or they will misrepresent someone and then maybe find out that they were wrong in a very public way as well. And then they'll just pretend that it never happened, and they get to move on. But that person, do they get to move on? When I think of that man who I have reached out to since, he doesn't necessarily get to move on in the same way I did, because if I've shared his handle, maybe there's someone that has me on such a pedestal that they feel that Africa shouldn't have had to go through this. So I'm going to, I don't know, make sure that this man pays, or it happens all the time. It happens all the time, right? So behind the scenes, that's when I started writing this letter.
Do you have, I'm sure that this is going to resonate with people, this conversation. Do you have suggestions for people who might be feeling that kind of like, I know what you mean when you do something that you're like, your soul doesn't agree with. And it's like, I think what I get is some sort of existential horror. And it's just like, It's just like everywhere. And it's like, you're going in the wrong direction of reality or something. So if people are stuck in that and are scared, how do those people try and stop and switch to going in the right direction? Hopefully that made some semblance of sense.
Right. And you know what, Mikhaila, I wish there was you can imagine that I get asked that question hundreds of times a day. And I think we want a simple answer, don't we? We want just one answer. That I don't think there's one answer.
Part of it is to try to listen to what you say, to what you're saying, and see if it makes you feel stronger or weaker.
Yeah.
Like each word is like a stepping stone through a swamp.
Right.
And if it's the right word, then you step on it and it feels secure and stable compared to the territory around it. And you test that out. And then you dare to see if that's the way you think, as opposed to that persona that you're putting on for public adulation and protection, right? That's the temptation of the actor. So in the movie Pinocchio, when Pinocchio is trying to stop lying and to become a real boy, he faces two major temptations apart from lying. One is to be a victim, and the other is to be an actor. It took me a long time to figure out why being an actor was a temptation. But you put your finger on it with your description. It's to adopt a set of roles that will appeal to narcissistic inflation, something like that. It's right. And there's a terrible totalitarian danger in that. It's terrible.
Yes.
So, and that's, my suspicions are that's what you were reacting to so viscerally, that you were participating in that. And you had your reasons, but you mentioned something that I think maybe the three of us could discuss that would be interesting, this idea about all white people being racist. So I kind of wondered about that as a psychologist, but more broadly, because maybe you could say, well, are all people racist? And here's what I mean by that. Well, we all have an in-group preference. Now, what that group might be, it might be you and the person you love, it might be you and your family, it might be you and your town, it might be you and your state or your country, it might be you and your race. That who that in-group is can vary, but we do have preferences for people, and we do have in-group preferences, and the corollary of that is that we have out-group skepticism and maybe fear and maybe disgust and all of that. And from what I've been able to understand anthropologically, that's more or less a human universal. As different peoples have been brought around the world into global community, let's say, one of the things that anthropologists have found is that it's almost always the case that any given tribe of people will use the word that refers to human beings to their tribe and some other word to everyone else. And so it's possible that that's a deep tendency that we all have to fight against. And I mean, there's part of the reason these ideas are so compelling to people and able to possess them, the wokeness ideas, let's say, to use a casual category, is that they contain an element of truth. People have an in-group preference that can easily be distorted into something that's quite akin to racism. I mean, you even see that in chimpanzees, for example. They'll go on raiding forays into neighboring territories, and if they outnumber, the males do this, if they outnumber the foreigners that they come across, they will tear them to pieces. So it's, that was a stunning discovery. Lovely that primatologists made. Jane Goodall's team discovered that in the 70s. It was a real shock. Wow. Right. So
they were trying to find all the nice chimps.
Yeah, well, they're
like, they just rip each other to shreds. Whoa, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no one had any inkling previous to that human tendency for war, broadly speaking, was so deep that it was even shared by our closest animal relative. So this is very deep. So, the idea that racism and in-group preference, all of that, is something that human beings struggle with is true. And then you say, well, you twist that a bit and you say, well, that's particularly true of white people because they hold the power. It's like, well, it's an interesting proposition. But the question is, well, if it's true, exactly how is it true and what's its limits? And how does that play out in the case of other races or groups, Asians, for example? Right. And what are the dangers of putting the idea that way? And what makes you so sure that that's also not true of your group? And how does power play into that? These are all genuine questions that we should be asking ourselves instead of hammering home the idea that we have the answer to this. It's like, well, you said, you got elevated as a black woman in this. Well, it's very difficult to not see that as an exacerbation of your in-group preference and then an exaggeration of that implicit or explicit racism on your part. And I think that's part of what you were rebelling against. Yes.
And you know what? The questions that you were just asking before, those are the exact questions that I had, just simple questions. And it started to signal again that something wasn't right here, that I couldn't even just ask the simplest questions, or at least felt that I couldn't. I could have, but I was much more scared of the consequences of asking the questions than leading with the curiosity of getting some kind of answer, right? And in my letter, Mikhaila, you read this part out earlier about the disempowerment of Black people. That's how I started to feel extremely disempowered. Even when people would say things like, yeah, it's because white people have all the power. According to who? And in what context are we talking about? Does it matter where in the world you are? Which ones? Right?
I had an experience like that. Not exactly like that. It was like that, but for me. And I was taking sciences because I'd switched out of humanities because there was a lot of, I was taking a course on Homer and it was Homer through the feminist lens. And I was like, that's not what I paid you guys for. So I switched into sciences, and about every couple of months, somebody would come in and they'd say, okay, for all the women in the room, I know you've had a much harder time getting to where you are than the men have. And I was just like, are you telling me I'm stupid? Like, what exactly are you saying here? And how dare you suggest that it was like insulting in kind of a condescending way, which was the complete opposite of whatever they were. Well, maybe it wasn't the opposite of what they were trying to do. But yeah, it's condescending and irritating.
Yeah, well, it
bugged me.
Well, think about what that does in some sense. It makes your generic femininity and your generic vulnerability far more important than your individual particularity. Yeah. And this is what I've been objecting to with regards to this group mentality from the beginning. It seems to me that its fundamental danger, the fundamental danger is the devaluation of the sacredness of the individual as the primary category. You replace that by group identity, you have no idea what kind of devil you're messing with. Or maybe you do to some degree. You experienced it a bit because you messed about with that devil and you got tempted, and 7,000 people told you were right. It's like, imagine you're a political leader. Okay, now imagine 30 million people tell you that you're right, and they chant that in a mob, and they do that everywhere you go. That's what happened in Germany. And then you play to the crowd. You're that actor. You play to the crowd, and you get hungrier and hungrier for that validation. And you train yourself to say anything the crowd demands, no matter how dark.
Right. And I find it extremely worrying, which is why I speak very, very loudly in the way that I do, especially online, because that's exactly what we're starting to see online. People saying whatever it takes to get that same level of validation and affirmation every single time. And when we go back to the question that you asked earlier of what did you then do after you removed that post, there were also other things that I did behind the scenes, which is where you come in again, Jordan. I thought to myself, okay, so who are some of the people that I discarded in the past because I was told to, not because it was a conscious decision that I made on my part? What was I told that I shouldn't read, that I shouldn't agree with, that I shouldn't listen to? And I specifically started listening to speakers. I would say actually this was more so after that specific incident online, but I had started doing this from late 2019, just challenging myself to sit through conversations being had by people I would never have listened to, people that are, let's say, on quote unquote the right, which is interesting because I've never identified as being part on the left. It's assumed because because of all of those identity markers and the things that I might agree with mostly, the things that I'm most aware of. It's just assumed to the point where maybe I started to assume that about myself, which is why I had resistance to the right. No, Mikhaila, go.
No. I just liked your. that was all. You go ahead.
But it's and also there's a cultural aspect to this. So I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. That's where I'm from. That's home. That's still the first language that I speak at home with my family. And I left there at the age of 9. I'm 29 now. And over identifying with a political party is just not really culturally a thing. No one even says things, like they're on the left or the right or they're ZANU-PF or MDC. Those are the political parties, but they're not. It's something that I see more of in the West, if you will, like on dating apps, people will have leftist or lefty or things like that.
They've become markers of religious affiliation. Yes, and that's also a terrible it's gone too far. And that's part of the danger of the loss of religion, is that you can't get rid of it. It crops up somewhere. Something else gets inflated into religious dimensions. And that's when things are, you're supposed to render unto Caesar what are Caesar's, and render unto God what are God's, what is God's. And if you render unto Caesar...
I just read that yesterday.
Yeah, great.
That's weird. That's weird. Okay.
Really?
And if you render...
Yeah, really.
If you render unto God... If you render unto Caesar what is God's, then Caesar gets inflated into a god. And that's another danger, and an existential danger for everyone. Like we have this rational idea that we can dispense with our religious values, but by definition, our religious values are our deepest values. By definition. And you have to have deep values or you're disintegrated and aimless. And they're going to come from somewhere and be placed somewhere. And if they slip out of a domain of religion that's set aside specially for that, then it's easy for the political to become inflated. And we don't want that. That's not good.
Right.
So, okay, so that's not happening in Zimbabwe. So
no.
And you see it here.
Oh, I see it.
Hey, second ad. What? Here I am again with my dinosaur shirt. I wanted to talk to you guys about NordVPN. I use VPNs when I'm traveling, which I'm doing a lot. Did you know they don't do Disney Plus in Serbia? Well, they do with NordVPN. Can't believe there are areas of the world that ban Disney. Did you also know they're putting trigger warnings in front of some Disney movies? Anyway, this isn't supposed to be about Disney or getting access to Disney. Well, maybe it's kind of about getting access to Disney. It's about NordVPN. NordVPN, not only are they sponsoring me, which is fantastic, but they do allow me to get into Netflix and Disney wherever I am. If I'm somewhere sketchy, I also can protect myself from getting my information stolen by using NordVPN in said sketchy areas. Or if you are doing something sketchy on the internet, a VPN is also probably what you're looking for. I also really like NordVPN because it has the fastest VPN in the world. It doesn't slow down my internet when streaming in different countries like other VPNs I've used. NordVPN is something I would really recommend. VPNs come in handy in restaurants, airports, other countries that block certain websites, and to hide your information when you want to. I have a fantastic code for 73% off annually for them, which is pretty huge. 73% off at nordvpn.com/TMPP. Like the Mikhaila Peterson podcast. Code TMPP for 73% off. That's nordvpn.com/TMPP. Code TMPP for 73% off annually. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
So what I decided to do was to just listen to different people. And I remember listening to some of your lectures, Jordan. I wouldn't be able to tell you which one specifically because I listened to so many, but in the beginning, and this was still happening last summer as well, I was sitting there just watching alone. And I remember even for a few months feeling like I'm doing something wrong. And this was
You probably were.
And this was such a bizarre feeling because, again, maybe I would have experienced this differently if I had family identified with being on, quote unquote, the left, or being a feminist. I've never identified in that way, or just any of these things that would kind of make sense for me to fully physically reject what I'm watching right now. But I had always considered myself to be quite balanced, right? But it took me sitting down, listening to you amongst other people to really realize just how sucked into these echo chambers I had been, because I felt as though I was betraying the movement in some kind of way. And you know what's so interesting? When I say the movement, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one. Pick any, that I'm betraying some kind of bigger collective purpose.
Why did you continue? Why did you do it? Why did you continue? And how did you know that voice wasn't the true voice of your conscience?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's a good question. I knew it because the discomfort that I felt wasn't anything compared to the sickness that I had felt for the past 2 years, actually being immersed in those spaces. And more than that, everything that not only you were saying and that other thinkers were saying, I remember listening to Larry Elder, for example, and feeling the very same things, if not more, because I was receiving certain information from a Black man. And I'd never heard anyone speak in that kind of way before, in a very objective way, talking about certain data as to why maybe he doesn't think there's systemic racism in the US, et cetera, just data-driven research. And I still felt that I couldn't. The cognitive dissonance, to just put it very simply, the cognitive dissonance was intense. But I sat with it because I'm very familiar with discomfort. I always see my sobriety and the journey to getting sober as the foundation that holds me in place when I'm feeling any kind of discomfort. Because when I go back to getting sober, for example, that final 8th time, I felt so uncomfortable. There was nothing in that moment. There was nothing empowering about it. It wasn't this profound decision that I made and that now I live a sober life. I had no other choice. Otherwise, I was going to be sick for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I think you make a choice like that, not in pride, but in abject humility.
Yes. And I see that process that I took myself through, of kind of giving myself back to myself is the way that I think of it, sitting through those lectures, hearing you talk, because I'd had an experience in relation to you years before where I had made a firm decision that I would never in my life listen to anything this man has to say. Based on a 3-minute clip, mind you.
Do you remember what it was that I said that was so profoundly irritating? I mean, there's many. Can you tell me what that was?
Of course, you were talking about the gender pay gap, and this was part of a longer interview. The interview that you had with Kathy Newman, and this was a clip, 3-minute clip. You were talking about the gender pay gap, and you were saying that, paraphrasing here, but that the reason for most women is because most women are agreeable, most women don't negotiate, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that was essentially giving people options as to why it could be that there's this thing that exists or doesn't exist. And I didn't even finish the clip. I didn't even finish the 3-minute clip. But based on the things that another out of context clip that I had seen before, and the way that I'd heard your name being spoken of before in the context of the trans conversation that was happening around that time, 2018. Right, exactly. Again, I was watching this clip and it's almost like I wasn't even listening to what you were saying. I had already decided that I don't like this man because someone that I trust has told me that I shouldn't like him. So therefore, the decision is made. Why do I even have to finish that video?
Right, of course.
And it was just, right? Mm-hmm. And it was just normal.
Well, we use heuristics like that all the time, and yes. It's easy to get caught up in them because, you can't listen to everyone. Yeah. And so you kind of have to make a snap judgment about almost everyone. And the default is you don't listen. Because there's like 7 billion people. So obviously you're not listening to most of them. So you don't need much of an excuse. And it's really easy for that to get... And I mean, it's not like I haven't experienced that. Like on my podcast, I invite people on. Abigail Schreier, for example, she wrote, I don't remember the name of her most recent book, but it's a investigation into the downside of the rush to make everything gender fluid, essentially. And I was terrified when I had her on. I mean, I was in rather ill health at irreversible damage. Yeah.
That's the one.
I want to have Andy Ngo on my podcast, but that also makes me nervous too. And, because he's tarred with the fascist brush and then it's guilt by association. And that might have been part of what you were feeling. So you think, you need a simplifying heuristic. And part of that is, that most people aren't worth listening to. And he's definitely not worth listening to. And, and then that can so easily become politicized. And once it is, especially when the political has become religious, it's really, really hard to overcome that.
Yeah,
and so,
it really is.
You know, a lot of the things that the radical left are pointing out are in some sense universal human failings. And so they have that truth about them. I mean, because we could ask ourselves, given the implicit tendency for human beings to have a pronounced in-group preference and the potential we have for violence against out-group members, how do we all address our proclivity to damn the foreigner? Okay, that's a really important question.
I feel like I've got a good answer.
Okay, let me add the one end to that. And then the next thing is, well, we all have these proclivities. How are they exacerbated by power and privilege? Right? Those are good questions. But as soon as we make it instantly racist, well, then we can't even ask the damn questions properly anymore. So, Mick, sorry.
My joke is over now.
Oh, I'm sorry. I stomped all over your timely joke.
You stomped all over my tiny little joke. I was thinking about that question earlier, though. If everyone has these tendencies, which they certainly do, I've noticed that if I have a guest on my podcast, and I think my audience is fairly open-minded, but then I'll have a guest on that, and they'll hate them. And they'll be like, well, you can't just, even if you don't agree with them, maybe they are wrong, but like you can't just cancel people because they don't agree with you because they're doing exactly the same thing that the people you're complaining about.
Well, you know, and also maybe your stupid opinions aren't right. They're probably not right. And like, are you so sure your life is going so much the way you want it to go? And you're such a bloody paragon of virtue and the light is shining out every orifice that everything you think and say is correct and everyone who disabuses you of your notions is evil. You're really so sure of that, are you?
Gosh.
So, you know, you wander around and you think, God, maybe I should listen to this person because I'm such an ignorant bastard and I'm so full of malevolence and maybe they'll drop one thing on me that won't make me like miserable and doomed to hell and to drag everyone else there too. That's yeah, well.
You know, I felt something similar when I finally leaned into listening to you properly, because what was interesting, even after that moment in 2018, watching that 3-minute clip, deciding this man is evil, I want nothing to do with him ever again. And of course, I didn't think I would ever have anything to do with him.
Yeah, look what happened. Ha ha.
Infiltrated.
Me,
yeah.
Right? People especially people that were not really connected to the digital world, a lot of older men in my life, for example, and women in my life would always tell me to read your book. It's honestly, people would always say to me, Africa, you will really love this book. I would have friends of mine send me lectures. I think you're really going to like this. And I would just completely ignore it. And in my mind, I'd be thinking, what am I going to find? What am I supposed to like? Because again, I have this idea of you built up in my head. So I'm finding it very confusing that people that know me very well are telling me that there's something that I'm going to like, right?
Yeah, what the hell?
Very confusing. But again, for years, what the hell? For years, I ignored it. So when I started watching your lectures late 2019 and last summer as well, in the beginning, I could notice myself listening to you and waiting for a moment where I could say, aha, see?
Right.
I knew I was right. And you know what? I waited. That moment never came. That moment never came.
That comes for me right? all the time.
Really. And that again, so it's like there wasn't one moment of being awake and then it's done. So many little, tiny, seemingly insignificant moments where I'm just sitting here by my sofa, just watching and listening, observing myself, waiting, for that confirmation that I'm right, and then it never coming, and then I have to deal with that. And then so again, my curiosity, I finally allowed myself to be curious again. And now, Jordan, I can say you have been one of the most influential people to me for so many reasons I couldn't even mention right now. But to be able to have the conversations that I do now publicly, you have, and I could have never imagined this ever in my entire life. Things like this don't just happen. And the fact that I can tell you this.
Oh no.
Thank you. Just thank you. Thank you.
You got him.
It's a pleasure. It's a rough pleasure, but
I know.
you know, you knew what happened to me with Marvel Comics?
Yeah.
That was something. It's really something to see yourself portrayed. You know, I got accused of being a Nazi pretty much when all this happened. It was really something because I had been teaching students what we're talking about today, about these temptations that you faced and how people, as individuals, get sucked into that totalitarian hell. You know, and then, so that was something for that to happen, such a reversal. And then to have that comic book come out, well, it was surreal. It was absolutely surreal to be portrayed, because Nazi wasn't enough, right? We had to go right for the archetype itself. So I think we've raised about $400,000 for charity now on the basis of that. So that was a fun reversal. But it was really shocking when I first saw that. I just couldn't believe it. I was very ill at the time too. And I thought, this can't be real. This has to be Photoshop. This cannot possibly be happening. It's so completely beyond comprehension. And, you know, to come from the pen of one of the foremost Black intellectuals. And I use the racial category only because that's the categories that he's using to operate within.
Yeah.
You know? So
life is really weird.
this is true.
Right.
This is true, as this whole conversation illustrates. So what have been the personal consequences for you of writing this letter and having it go? I mean, I mean, have you been pilloried? What's happened to you?
I haven't received, and this is something that I don't think about so much, actually, because I prefer to just allow it to be whatever it is right now, to not expect it, or it just is. But I actually have not received any pushback from this. And for it to have been read by over 4 million people, and for me to not have been aggressively dragged through the streets of social media, you know, by my neck, it's...
Why not? Why hasn't it happened? Why do you think? What's operating to protect you, do you think?
You know what? It would be very naive of me to think that my identity markers, the ones we've been speaking about, don't have anything to do with that. I think people are more willing to listen to what I'm saying because of the fact that I'm Black. If I had been white, for example, a lot of what I'm saying, the more universal things that are not specific to me being Black or Zimbabwean, they would have just been dismissed, because there are many things people have been saying over the past years that are just common sense. They make sense. People have genuine questions, but no one will listen to it because the first thing they will see is that you inhabit a white body, so you don't get to speak, you know? So I think people are more willing to hear what I have to say because of that. And I think it's also because I'm not preaching to anyone. I'm not telling anyone what to do.
Yeah,
that's a,
right? Right? I'm not an academic. I'm not trying to give you data. And this is not about that. This is a very personal account from someone that has been in it. I'm not righteous. I'm not above you or below you, right? This is just me saying, hey, no, I'm opting out of this game. And we all get to opt out, you know? And I think that's why it has been received very well, because I'm speaking from the I. I'm speaking from my own personal experience. And I think it can be very hard to dispute that.
Well, you can't. Well, there's something interesting about that too, because one of the mantras of the left, I hate to use these categories, but we're stuck with it at the moment.
Yes.
You know, the implicit truth of subjectivity. And the thing is, and the thing is, there's something right about that, because there is a domain of knowledge that you have privileged access to that no one can dispute. And that domain of knowledge is your honest representation of your subjective experience. And that it does have the kind of power that you just described. And so there's some sense in noting that as a form of truth. But then the claim seems to have got twisted and perverted in some way, which is, it kind of gets elevated narcissistically. It's like, because I have this domain where I am the only person who has access to those experiences, then all of a sudden that gets inflated in this political way into a narcissistic claim that, that means overall my truths are as good as any truth and they're as good as anyone else's. And there's an error there, right? Because despite the fact that there are things that you can say, that only you can say, that no one can dispute, there are all sorts of things that you can't say, that you don't know, and that are absolutely subject to dispute.
Yes.
And so it's the narcissistic inflation of the claim beyond its reasonable boundaries. And then your conscience, I think, was operating in you to say, well, where are the boundaries of this claim? Like let's take the war, so to speak, between Black people and the police in the United States. Well, obviously that's a problem, but it's a really, really complex problem. And maybe we want to have an instant solution to it, but we don't have an instant solution to it. And so the claim is, well, this is a problem. And then the next claim is, well, it's based in racism. And then the next claim is it's based in white supremacy. It's like, well, wait a second. There's a problem here. And the problem with coming up with a solution so rapidly is, well, you don't know. You actually don't know. This is actually a really complicated problem. And your intuition that it's a problem is dead on. And your intuition that it would be reasonable morally to be concerned about that is dead on. But the right approach is questioning, not answering. And I think part of the reason that I've got away with my lectures online, I think, maybe, and as a professor for that matter, is I do my best to always question. And even in my public lectures on the tour, I usually think of a question that I'm trying to answer. And then when I go out and lecture, I'm trying to explore the question. I'm not telling the audience what they should think. I don't know what they should think. I don't even know what I should think. And so I can guide them through the process of exploration. And that seems to, well, so far that seems to be working. And that's what we're doing in this conversation. And that's partly what makes it a good conversation, is we're trying to figure something out that we don't know.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that. And I think that directly speaks to why my letter has reached people in the way that it has. And it's received such a positive reception, overwhelmingly so. I still receive hundreds of people messaging me every single day, emails. And But
you don't get the sickness from that you got with that other. Okay, no. So that's interesting too. So how do you know that this positive response is credible?
Oh, that's a very good question. How do I know that this positive response is credible? It's a knowing that I don't quite have language for. Because another reality of this is that when you have so many eyes on you and you know that something like this is out there, there is a discomfort that comes with it. But for me, that discomfort is adding to my well-being. It's not taking from my well-being. So it's very difficult for me to sort of give a neat answer to that, but it's a very deep knowing. And I'm sure you both know what I mean by that. And that when I receive messages from people in all corners of the world telling me that my letter has freed them, people sending me voice notes crying and saying that they were ostracized by their family members for not supporting certain political movements last year or not making certain medical decisions that they don't think were the best ones to make, et cetera, et cetera. Because we're in a time where in my lifetime anyway, we're more polarized than I've ever seen before. It's so intense. So the messages that I receive from real life people giving me specific accounts of what is happening in their lives and how coming across my words that I didn't even think were going to reach many people. And that 4 million means something. And it's not just to me, it's not a vanity metric of saying 4 million people. I couldn't give a shit about anything like that. I really don't. It's about what that represents. When I have other Black people telling me that I've given them some kind of permission slip to think differently, because as Black people, this is something that I have to be honest about, especially in the West. We're not afforded the same level of individuality as everyone else. We're sort of placed in the oppressed category by default, and it's almost like you have to fight for your individuality. I say this in my letter, but Black people
so
are not a monolith.
What is the weight of that? So, I mean, hypothetically, right? The theory is, well, we're trying to help you by defining you as oppressed. Right? I mean, that's the theory, because we see that, well, even if you use racial metrics, for example, there's inequality. And so the inequality is directed at you as a racial group. So the first thing you have to swallow is that you should be referred to primarily by your racial group, right? To be the beneficiary of that victim status. So that's something very insidious. It's very insidious. But we can give the devil his due and say, well, there's some genuine concern there too. But Mikhaila mentioned earlier how she felt when she was placed in the oppressed category, briefly in a science class. And it's like you just said that you're, in some sense, burdened with that, struggling with that all the time. What's the cost of that? Or is that what we're talking about continually in this conversation?
That is what we're talking about. That is what we're talking about. And again, I see all of these conversations quite differently because I wasn't born and raised here in the Western world. So I do have something else to compare it to. And of course, because of my geographical location, being in Zimbabwe, being in Africa, where everyone around me is the same. I always say I found out that I was actually Black when I was 9 years old when I came here. I didn't know that before. I didn't have to think about that. Why would I have had to think about that? Now suddenly I'm hearing Black, you're this. Oh, you like, Motley Crue, but you're Black. Black people don't like that. Or you.
Do you like Led Zeppelin?
Right, I love Led Zeppelin.
Oh, yeah,
but should I? Should I listen to
definitely
them in
not.
secret?
Definitely. Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely.
Right. So now there are suddenly all of these this list of things that I should and shouldn't like, but they're attached to my skin color. So to me, a lot of this has always just been extremely bizarre. So I've never over-identified with any of those labels. I do understand their importance. I really do. I really, really do. And I do know that because of those identity markers, I'm treated in a certain way, et cetera, but I don't over-identify with them in the way that some people wish I did, which I think was the issue of everything that I've been experiencing. But yeah, I think I just view a lot of this very differently because culturally, it just doesn't make sense for me to make my quote unquote Blackness the entirety of who I am. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. Well,
it's certainly not an accomplishment of yours.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's not associated with anything you've done, good or bad, as an active agent. And so it's hard for me to see the advantage of that kind of identification. And easy for me to see the disadvantages.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
Okay, guys, we have to call it quits. That was an absolute honor to host both of you. I am so happy that we all got to do this. Before we go, Africa, could you tell people, if they don't follow you, where they could go to follow you, where you are online?
Of course. So my only social media at this moment in time is Instagram. You can find me at Africa Brooke with an E at the end. I have a lot of live conversations there. I do a lot of live podcasting. I'm just a curious person, and I allow myself to do that publicly with all of you. So you can join me there. If you want to find out more about my work, my website is africabrooke.com.
Thanks, guys. That was really cool.
It was a pleasure meeting you and
much.
talking to you. Very nice to meet you.
And you too, Jordan. Thank you so much. Thank you.